In the depths of winter, when frost painted intricate patterns on stone walls and breath turned to mist even indoors, the greatest ladies of medieval Europe huddled beneath mountains of fur, their nobility no shield against the biting cold that claimed fingers, toes, and sometimes lives. Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, as you rest in your warm bed, let me carry you back through the centuries to a world where even queens shivered through the night, where cold was not an inconvenience but a constant companion, and where survival through winter was a victory worth celebrating. Close your eyes now, and let us journey together to the year 1347, to a castle in northern France, where a young woman named Eleanor was learning what it truly meant to be noble. Eleanor de Montfort was 19 years old on the November morning when she first arrived at Château Beaumont, her new home as the bride of Lord Richard, a man 30 years her senior whom she had met only twice before their wedding. She sat in the jolting carriage, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching through the small window as the imposing fortress grew larger against the gray sky. The journey from her father's estate had taken 6 days, and each mile had carried her further from everything she had known, from the warm manor house where she had grown up, from her sisters Margaret and Anne, from her mother's gentle voice singing evening prayers. Eleanor had not cried when they said goodbye, though Margaret, only 14, had wept openly. Their mother had embraced her tightly and whispered words that Eleanor kept turning over in her mind like stones in a river. Remember, my darling, that a lady's strength is not in her sword arm, but in her ability to endure, to adapt, to find warmth even in the coldest of places. The castle, when she finally stood before it, seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Its walls rose thick and gray, built not for comfort but for defense, with narrow windows that let in little light and less warmth. The great hall, where she was formally presented to the household staff and the few nobles who served her husband, had a massive fireplace at one end, large enough for a grown man to stand inside, yet the heat it produced seemed to dissipate into the vast stone space like water poured onto sand. Eleanor tried not to shiver as she stood there in her finest wool gown, dyed a deep blue that had cost her father dearly, trimmed with the ermine fur that marked her status. The servants curtsied and bowed, their faces polite but reserved, watching this new young lady who would now command their work and their loyalty. Her husband, Lord Richard, was a stern man with graying hair and a face weathered by years of managing his lands and serving in the king's wars. He was not unkind to Eleanor in those first days, but neither was he affectionate. He spoke to her as he might speak to a capable servant, explaining the castle's routines, introducing her to the steward and the chamberlain, the cook and the head groom. At night, he came to her chamber to perform his marital duties with a sort of businesslike efficiency that left Eleanor feeling more lonely than she had ever felt in her life. Afterward, he would return to his own rooms, and she would lie in the great bed, listening to the wind howl around the castle towers, feeling the cold creep in through the stone walls despite the tapestries hung to provide some insulation. It was her lady's maid, Beatrice, who first showed Eleanor the reality of winter in the castle. Beatrice was a woman of perhaps 40 years, daughter of one of the castle servants, who had been assigned to attend Eleanor. She had a practical, no-nonsense manner that Eleanor found both comforting and slightly intimidating. On Eleanor's third night at Chateau Beaumont, as she prepared for bed, Beatrice brought armful after armful of furs into the chamber, heavy pelts of bear and wolf, fox and rabbit, even a magnificent white ermine robe that had belonged to Lord Richard's first wife. "You'll need all of these, my lady," Beatrice said, spreading them across the bed with practiced efficiency. "Come December, when the real cold sets in, you'll understand. The fires help, of course, but they must be allowed to die down at night, else we'd burn through our entire winter store of wood by February. And these stone walls, thick as they are for keeping out enemies, they hold the cold something fierce. I've seen winter mornings when the water in the washing basin was frozen solid, ice nearly an inch thick." Eleanor had thought Beatrice was exaggerating, offering the kind of dramatic warning that old servants sometimes gave to test young mistresses. But when December came, bringing with it storms that lasted days, she understood. The cold was unlike anything she had experienced in her father's manor, which had been smaller, more tightly built, easier to heat. Here in this vast fortress, the cold was a living presence, a force that pressed against you, found every gap in your clothing, every exposed bit of skin. Eleanor would wake in the morning with her breath misting in the air, her nose and cheeks numb despite being buried in furs. The rushes on the floor would be stiff with frost near the walls. The tapestries would move in drafts that found their way through the stone, no matter how carefully the walls had been built. She learned quickly to dress in layers. First, the linen chemises against her skin, then a wool underdress, then the outer gown, and over all of that, a surcoat lined with fur. On her hands, wool gloves beneath leather ones. On her feet, wool stockings and leather boots lined with rabbit fur. Around her shoulders, a heavy cloak fastened with a bronze brooch that had belonged to Lord Richard's mother. And yet still she was cold. In the great hall, she would sit as close to the fire as propriety allowed, her hands stretched toward the flames, trying to drive the chill from her bones. The other ladies of the household did the same, gathered around the fire like worshippers at an altar, their faces flushed red on one side, pale on the other. Nighttime was the worst of all. The chamber she shared with Lord Richard, or rather, the chamber that was hers since he spent most nights in his own rooms, had its own fireplace, smaller than the one in the great hall but still substantial. Beatrice would build up the fire in the evening, banking it carefully so that it would burn slowly through the night. But even so, by morning it would be reduced to embers, and the cold would have crept in. Eleanor took to wearing her wool stockings to bed, a fur-lined cap to keep her ears warm, and sleeping in her chemise and an additional wool night robe. The bed itself was piled so high with furs and wool blankets that she could barely see over them when she sat up. She would burrow down into this nest of warmth, creating a small pocket of heat with her body, and try not to think about how many hours remained until dawn. It was during one of those long, cold nights in late December that Eleanor first heard the crying. She had been lying awake, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, listening to the wind shriek around the castle towers like a living thing in pain. And beneath that sound, or perhaps woven through it, she heard something else, a high, thin wailing that made her skin prickle with something more than cold. She sat up in bed, pulling the furs around her shoulders, straining to hear. There it was again, a sound of such profound grief that her heart clenched in sympathy. Without thinking, she rose from bed, wrapping herself in the great ermine robe, and went to the door. The corridor beyond was dark and freezing, lit only by a single rush light burning in a wall sconce. The sound seemed to be coming from further down the passage, from the direction of the tower stairs. She found the source in a small chamber at the base of the tower, a room she had not yet explored in her weeks at the castle. Inside, huddled on a narrow bed with only a thin blanket for covering, was a girl of perhaps 13 or 14, sobbing as if her heart would break. Eleanor approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "Child," she said softly, "what troubles you so?" The girl looked up, her face pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror at seeing the lady of the castle in her shabby little room. She tried to rise to curtsy, but Eleanor waved her back down. "Please don't trouble yourself. Tell me your name and why you weep." "I'm called Alice, my lady," the girl said, her voice shaking with cold emotion. "I'm sorry to have disturbed you. I tried to be quiet, truly I did." "Alice," Eleanor repeated, kneeling beside the bed despite the icy stone floor biting through her robe. "You're freezing. Where are your furs? Your blankets?" Alice's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I have this blanket, my lady. It's all that was given me when I came to serve here. I'm just a kitchen maid, you see. The good blankets and furs, there for the upper servants and the family." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a mixture of anger and shame. She had been so consumed with her own discomfort, her own adjustment to this new life, that she had not thought about those below her station, those who had far less to shield them from the cold. Here she was, buried under mountains of expensive furs, and this child was shivering under a single threadbare blanket. "How long have you been at the castle, Alice?" she asked. 3 months, my lady. I came from the village when my mother died of a fever. My father has 6 other children to feed, and the cook needed a girl to help prepare the vegetables and scrub the pots. I'm grateful for the position, truly I am. It's just," her voice broke. "It's just that I'm so cold, and I miss my mother, and I don't know how I'll bear it until spring." Eleanor made a decision. Then that would alter not just Alice's life, but her own understanding of her role as Lady of Chateau Beaumont. She stood, pulling the ermine robe from her own shoulders, and wrapped it around Alice's thin frame. The girl gasped, trying to refuse, but Eleanor was firm. "Hush now. I have plenty of furs in my chamber. Tomorrow, I will speak with Beatrice about getting you proper blankets and a warmer room. Tonight you will use this. And in the morning, when you've rested, I want you to come to my chamber. I find myself in need of a second maid, someone young and clever who can help me navigate this household." Would you be willing to serve me?" Alice stared at her, as if she had offered her the crown jewels of France. "My lady, Yes, oh yes, I would be honored, but I know nothing of serving a noble lady. I can only scrub pots and chop vegetables." "Then you shall learn," Eleanor said, and for the first time since arriving at Chateau Beaumont, she felt a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with fires or furs. "I know nothing of being a proper lady of a great castle, so we shall learn together. Now sleep, child. Tomorrow begins a new life for both of us." As Eleanor made her way back to her chamber, the ermine robe left behind with Alice, she felt the cold bite through her remaining layers with renewed ferocity. But she also felt something else, something that had been missing since she left her childhood home: purpose. She had been thinking of herself as a victim of her circumstances, a pawn moved on the chessboard of noble marriages. But she was the lady of this castle, and with that title came not just privileges but responsibilities. If she was going to survive this life, if she was going to find meaning in it, she needed to look beyond her own comfort to the welfare of all those who lived within these cold stone walls. When she reached her chamber, Beatrice was there, building up the fire for the night. The maid looked up in surprise at seeing Eleanor without her robe, her face showing concern. "My lady, where is your ermine? You'll catch your death wandering the halls in just your night clothes." "I gave it to Alice, the kitchen maid in the tower room," Eleanor said, climbing back into her bed and pulling the furs around herself. "Beatrice, why does a child sleep in such conditions? Surely we have spare blankets, extra bedding." Beatrice's face grew carefully neutral, the expression of a servant who has learned not to criticize the household management. The previous Lady Beaumont, God rest her soul, ran the household quite strictly. She believed that servants should be kept on the edge of discomfort, that it kept them working hard and prevented them from becoming lazy. Lord Richard has simply continued her policies. "It's not unusual, my lady, in most great houses." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but it will not continue in mine. Tomorrow, I want you to take inventory of all the bedding, all the furs and blankets in the storage rooms. I want to know who sleeps where and what they have to keep them warm. We will make changes." Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since Eleanor had met her, a genuine smile crossed her face. "Yes, my lady. It will be as you say." That night, despite being one robe short in her pile of furs, Eleanor slept better than she had since arriving at the castle. She dreamed not of her old home, but of the days ahead, of the small differences she might make in this cold, imposing fortress that was now her domain. The next morning brought with it a crisis that would test Eleanor's newfound resolve. She was awakened not by Beatrice but by a commotion in the corridor, voices raised in alarm. She rose quickly, wrapping herself in furs, and opened her door to find servants rushing past, their faces tight with worry. "What's happened?" she asked, stopping one of the chambermaids. "It's young Thomas, my lady, Lord Pierre's son. He's taken gravely ill in the night. The physician has been sent for, but..." The girl's face showed her doubt that even a physician could help. Eleanor knew Lord Piers slightly. He was one of her husband's bannermen, a knight who lived in the castle with his family, helping to manage the estate and providing military service when needed. His son Thomas was 7 years old, a quiet boy she had seen playing in the bailey with the other children. She followed the commotion to the family's chambers in the West Tower, where she found Lord Piers' wife, Lady Catherine, kneeling beside a small bed where Thomas lay, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored and rasping. "Lady Catherine," Eleanor said softly from the doorway. "May I enter?" The woman looked up, her face ravaged with fear and tears. "My lady," she said, rising quickly and attempting a curtsy despite her distress. "Forgive me, I should have sent word, but Thomas, he—" "Please," Eleanor said, coming to kneel beside the bed. She placed her hand on the child's forehead and felt the terrifying heat of the fever. "How long has he been like this?" "Since sometime in the night. He went to bed well enough, perhaps a little tired, but when I checked on him in the early hours, he was burning with fever and could barely draw breath. His lungs sound terrible, like something is drowning him from within." Eleanor had seen fever before and had lost a younger brother to it when she was 12. She knew the signs of a serious illness, and what she saw in Thomas frightened her, but she also knew that panic helped no one. "Has he been cold? Has his chamber been properly heated?" Lady Catherine's face crumpled. "We had a fire, but it went out in the night, and I didn't realize until it was too late. These chambers are so drafty, and the wind last night was fierce. I should have checked, should have built the fire higher, but I was so tired and I thought, oh God, this is my fault." "Stop," Eleanor said firmly. "Self-blame serves no purpose now. Where is the physician?" "Being fetched from the village, but in this weather it could take hours." Eleanor made rapid decisions, the kind she had not known she was capable of making. "Send for Beatrice immediately. Have hot water brought and clean linens. We need to make Thomas sweat out this fever. And bring braziers, as many as can be safely placed in this room. We need it warm as a summer day. Quickly now." The servants scattered to obey, and Eleanor set to work with Lady Catherine at her side. They stripped away Thomas's sweat-soaked night clothes and sponged him with warm water, then wrapped him in clean, warm linens and piled furs upon him until he was buried in warmth. Beatrice arrived with Alice in tow, the young girl's eyes wide at being brought into such a crisis, but her hands steady as she helped position the braziers around the room, feeding them with precious charcoal until the chamber grew almost stifling. Eleanor had them hang blankets over the windows to keep out drafts, and she ordered a special tisane made from herbs she remembered her mother using for lung complaints: hyssop and thyme, horehound and licorice root, steeped in hot water with honey. For hours they worked in that overheated room, Eleanor and Lady Catherine taking turns spooning the tisane into Thomas's mouth, keeping him covered in furs, watching for any change in his condition. Eleanor's own body ran with sweat under her heavy clothing, her face flushed from the heat, but she did not move from the child's side. She told him stories in a low, calm voice, tales of knights and dragons that her father had told her, of saints and miracles. She did not know if he could hear her in his fevered dreams, but she hoped that her voice was a thread he could follow back from whatever dark place the illness had taken him. The physician, when he finally arrived in late afternoon, was a wizened old man named Master Gervais, who had been tending the people of the region for 40 years. He examined Thomas with gentle, practiced hands, listening to his chest, checking his pulse, peering into his mouth and eyes. Then he straightened and looked at Alina with an expression of surprised approval. "You've done exactly right, my lady." The warmth, the steam from the tisane, keeping him wrapped and comfortable. "This is lung fever, brought on by exposure to cold and dampness. It could have killed him, and still might if we're not careful, but you've given him a fighting chance. Continue as you have been. Keep the room warm, keep forcing fluids into him and pray. That's all any of us can do now." Through that night and the next day, Alina maintained her vigil, catching only brief moments of sleep in a chair by Thomas's bed, while Lady Catherine did the same. Lord Piers hovered at the edges of the room, his weathered face creased with worry, clearly uncomfortable in the sick chamber, but unable to stay away from his son. Lord Richard appeared once, surveying the scene with his usual stern expression, and Alina braced herself for criticism of the resources being devoted to one sick child, the expense of the charcoal burning constantly in the braziers, the disruption to the household. Instead, he simply said, "You're doing well, Alina. Catherine, your son is in capable hands. I will see that the physician is properly compensated, and that whatever is needed for Thomas's care is provided." It was the first time he had called her simply Alina, without the formal Lady Beaumont, and the first time she had felt that he saw her as something more than a brood mare brought in to provide heirs. Something small and warm kindled in her chest, quite apart from the stifling heat of the sick room. On the second night, Thomas's fever broke. Alina was spooning more tisane into his mouth when his eyes fluttered open, truly focused for the first time since the fever had taken him. He looked up at her with confusion, then at his mother, who gave a sob of relief and gathered him carefully into her arms. "Mama," he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. "Why are you crying? Why is it so hot?" Lady Catherine laughed through her tears, and Alina felt her own eyes sting with emotion. "You've been ill, my darling. But you're going to be fine now. Everything is going to be fine." As dawn broke over Chateau Beaumont, Alina finally left the sick room and returned to her own chamber. She was exhausted beyond measure, her clothes soaked with sweat and rumpled from 2 days of wear, her hair falling from its braids. But she was also filled with a sense of accomplishment, of having made a real difference in someone's life. She had saved a child, or at least helped to save him, and in doing so had earned the gratitude and respect of his parents, the admiration of the household servants, and something new from her husband, something that might, over time, grow into affection. Beatrice helped her out of her soiled clothing and into a warm bath. despite Eleanor's protests that such a luxury in the middle of winter was unnecessary. "Nonsense, my lady," Beatrice said firmly. "You've been working yourself to the bone. Let me care for you now as you've cared for others." As Eleanor sank into the warm water, feeling the tension drain from her muscles, Beatrice said quietly, "You've changed things here, my lady. Already in just a few weeks, the servants are talking about it. They're saying that we finally have a lady who cares about more than just her own comfort." "I care about my own comfort a great deal," Eleanor admitted with a tired smile. "I'm still learning to manage these terrible cold chambers. I wake up freezing every morning despite all the furs in Christendom." "Ah, but that's just it, isn't it?" Beatrice said, beginning to work soap through Eleanor's hair with gentle hands. "The cold affects us all, from the highest to the lowest. The old lady, Lord Richard's first wife, never understood that. She thought her noble blood made her more sensitive to cold, more deserving of warmth than common folk. But you've seen the truth, that we all suffer alike, and that kindness costs nothing but means everything." Eleanor thought about this as Beatrice rinsed her hair and helped her from the bath, wrapping her in warmed linen towels that had been hung near the fire. It was true that the cold was a great equalizer. A stone wall kept out enemies but held in cold for everyone, regardless of rank. A fire warmed whoever sat nearest it. A fur blanket sheltered whoever slept beneath it. The only difference was that some people had more furs, more fires, more shelter, while others had less. But the cold itself, the bitter medieval winter that pressed against the castle walls and found every crack and crevice, cared nothing for noble blood or common birth. Over the following weeks, as winter tightened its grip on the land and snow piled high against the castle walls, Eleanor discovered that her actions during Thomas's illness had fundamentally altered her position in the household. Servants who had previously kept a careful, respectful distance now smiled when they saw her, offered small confidences, and came to her with problems they would never have brought to the stern Lady Beaumont who had ruled before. Lady Catherine became a true friend, the first Eleanor had found in the castle, and the two women spent hours together in Catherine's solar, working on their embroidery and talking about everything from the management of still rooms to the peculiar habits of their husbands. It was Catherine who first explained to Eleanor the intricate politics of heat distribution in a medieval castle. They were sitting near Catherine's fireplace on a particularly brutal January afternoon, the kind of day when the very air seemed to crystallize with cold, when Catherine suddenly laughed at something Eleanor had said about wishing she could simply move her bed into the great hall and sleep by the massive fire there. "You could, you know," Catherine said, her needle flashing as she worked a delicate pattern of roses onto a linen altar cloth. "In my grandmother's time, that's exactly what the great families did in the deepest winter. Everyone would sleep in the hall, from the lord and lady down to the lowest servants, all huddled together for warmth. Privacy was considered less important than survival. But as castles became more sophisticated, as we built more rooms and chambers, we spread ourselves out. We gained privacy, but lost the communal warmth. Now we each freeze in our separate rooms, maintaining our dignity while our fingers go numb. Elena paused in her own stitching, considering this. So the progression toward privacy has actually made us colder. In every sense of the word, Catherine said with a meaningful look. We wall ourselves off from each other, literally and figuratively. The Lord sleeps in his chamber, the lady in hers, the children in theirs, the servants scattered throughout the castle. We maintain proper separation of ranks and genders, but we lose the warmth of human company. My grandmother used to tell stories of winter nights when the entire household would gather in the hall, and they would tell stories and sing songs until late into the night, keeping the fires burning high and the cold at bay through sheer human fellowship. Now we retire early to our cold chambers, alone with our thoughts and our furs. Do you think it's better? Elena asked. The old way, I mean. Catherine was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling on her embroidery. I think each way has its cost and its benefits. Privacy allows for intimacy between husband and wife, for quiet contemplation and prayer, but it also isolates us. When Thomas was so ill, what saved him wasn't just the physician's skill or your excellent nursing. It was the fact that so many people gathered in that room, bringing their warmth and their care and their hope. We created a community around his suffering, and that community helped heal him. Elena thought about this conversation, often in the days that followed. She began to notice the ways the castle's inhabitants navigated the tension between warmth and privacy, between survival and dignity. The younger servants, she observed, often slept 2 or 3 to a bed, sharing body heat even as they gave up personal space. The stable hands and grooms bedded down in the hay lofts above the horses, where the animals' warmth rose to keep them comfortable. The kitchen staff, lowest in the hierarchy but perhaps warmest of all, slept in small rooms adjacent to the kitchen, where the massive ovens were banked but never fully cold. Only the nobles truly suffered in isolation, maintaining their separate chambers and their propriety while the cold gnawed at them through the long winter nights. Elena began to understand why her ermine robe and the mountains of furs on her bed were not mere luxury, but absolute necessity. A queen or great lady could not simply crawl into bed with her servants for warmth, no matter how practical that might be. Her rank required her to maintain certain standards, certain separations, and those separations came with a price paid in comfort and warmth. It was Alice who helped Elena understand the full hierarchy of furs. On one of the many evenings they spent together in Elena's chamber. The girl had blossomed in her new position as Elena's second maid, revealing a sharp intelligence and an unexpected talent for organization. She had quickly learned to dress Elena's hair in the elaborate styles required for formal occasions, to care for Elena's clothing and jewels, and to anticipate her lady's needs before Elena herself was aware of them. But Alice had also retained her connection to the lower servants, and she brought Elena news and gossip from parts of the castle that a great lady would never normally hear about. Each fur has its meaning, my lady. Alice explained as she brushed Alina's hair before bed, the long strokes soothing and rhythmic. Ermine like your white robe, that's for royalty and the highest nobility. It comes from a small creature that lives in the far north, and it's terribly expensive because each pelt is so tiny. It takes dozens of them to make a single robe. That's why common folk never see it except on ceremonial occasions. Then there's sable from Russia, nearly as expensive and reserved for princes and dukes. Below that is marten and fox, which are what wealthy merchants and lesser nobles wear. Then rabbit and squirrel, which are common furs that anyone with a bit of money can afford. And at the very bottom, sheepskin and woolen blankets, which is what most people have. "What did you have before you came here?" Alina asked. "At your father's house." Alice's hands paused for just a moment in their brushing. "Sheepskin, my lady, that we shared between all of us. The youngest children slept 3 to a bed in the middle, where it was warmest, and the older ones on the outside. My mother and father had their own bed with the sheepskin over them, and in the worst cold, they would bring the littlest ones to sleep between them. When my mother died, her voice wavered. When she died, the warmth went out of the house in more ways than one. That's why my father sent me here. One less mouth to feed, one less body needing to be kept warm." Alina reached up and took Alice's hand, squeezing it gently. "You're warm here now, and you'll stay warm. I promise you that." True to her word, Alina had made good on her plans to redistribute the castle's resources more equitably. She had discovered, much to her shock, that the storage rooms held dozens of old furs and blankets that had belonged to previous generations of the Beaumont family, items that were simply moldering in chests while servants froze in their beds. With Beatrice's help, she had these items brought out, aired, mended where necessary, and distributed to those who needed them most. The older furs, too worn for noble use but still serviceable, went to the servants. The good woolen blankets were given to the soldiers who guarded the walls, men who had previously slept in their cloaks with whatever covering they could scavenge. This redistribution had not been without controversy. Chamberlain, a pinch-faced man named Hugh who had served the old Lady Beaumont for 20 years, had objected strenuously to Alina's reforms. "My lady," he had said, his tone just barely managing to stay on the right side of insolence, "these items are the property of the House of Beaumont. They represent wealth accumulated over generations. To simply give them away to servants is irregular. What will Lord Richard say when he discovers that family heirlooms have been handed out like common charity?" Alina had drawn herself up to her full height, calling upon reserves of authority she hadn't known she possessed. "The items I have distributed are not heirlooms but practical goods that were rotting in storage while people in this household suffered. As for what Lord Richard will say, I have already informed him of my intentions, and he has given his approval. Or do you question your lord's judgment, Hugh?" The chamberlain had paled and backed down, but Alina knew she had made an enemy. Hugh represented the old ways, the strict hierarchy that kept nobles and commons rigidly separated, that valued preservation of wealth over practical human need. In challenging his authority, Eleanor had declared herself an agent of change, and change was always threatening to those who benefited from the status quo. But the gratitude of those who received the blankets and furs far outweighed Hugh's resentment. Eleanor would never forget the face of old Bernard, the master of the stables, when she personally brought him a worn but serviceable bearskin that had belonged to Lord Richard's grandfather. The old man had actually wept, his gnarled hands running over the thick fur as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "My lady," he had said, his voice choked with emotion, "I've served the Beaumont family for 43 years, since I was a boy younger than the lads I teach now. Never in all that time has anyone above stairs given a thought to whether I was warm or cold, comfortable or suffering. You've been here for 2 months, and already you've shown more kindness than I've received in 4 decades. God bless you, my lady. God bless you and keep you." It was moments like these that made Eleanor understand the true nature of her power as lady of the castle. She could not change the feudal system, could not alter the fundamental inequalities of medieval society. But within her domain, within the sphere of her influence, she could make small differences that had large impacts on individual lives. A blanket, a fur, a kind word, a moment of genuine concern. These things cost her little but meant everything to those who received them. As January gave way to February, the coldest month of the year, Eleanor began to understand another truth about medieval winters. That survival was not just about having enough fuel and furs, but about maintaining hope. The cold was not merely a physical challenge, but a psychological one. Day after day of gray skies and biting wind, week after week of being unable to go outside without wrapping oneself in layers of wool and fur, the endless nights that seemed to stretch forever, these things wore on the spirit as much as on the body. She saw it in the faces of the servants, a certain dullness in their eyes, a heaviness in their movements. She felt it in herself, a lethargy that made even small tasks seem overwhelming. The cold made everything harder. Getting out of bed in the morning, washing in frigid water, moving through icy corridors to reach other parts of the castle, sitting still long enough to accomplish necessary work when your feet and hands ached with chill. And underneath all of it was the knowledge that there were still weeks, perhaps months, before true warmth would return. It was Lord Richard, surprisingly, who suggested a solution. He came to Eleanor's chamber one evening in mid-February, an unusual occurrence since their interactions were typically formal and public. She was sitting by her fire, wrapped in furs, trying to focus on a letter to her sister Margaret, but the words wouldn't come. She felt trapped, suffocated by the stone walls and the endless cold, and she knew the feeling showed on her face. "Eleanor," Richard said, and there was a gentleness in his voice she had rarely heard, "you look like a caged bird. This winter is hard on you." "No harder than on anyone else," she said, trying to summon a smile. "I'm warm enough, I have plenty to eat. I'm more fortunate than most." "But you're not happy," he said bluntly, sitting in the chair across from her. You hide it well, but I can see it. You miss your home, your family. And this castle, it's not designed for comfort. It's a fortress first, a home second. Eleanor didn't know what to say. It was the most personal conversation they had ever had, and she was afraid of saying the wrong thing, of offending him. But he seemed to want honesty, so she gave it to him. I am adjusting, she said carefully. But yes, it's hard. Everything is so much colder here, so much more isolated. At my father's house we were closer, I suppose. The house was smaller, and we saw each other more often and spent more time together. Here, everyone is separated, scattered throughout the castle, and the cold makes it difficult to move around, to connect. I sometimes feel like I'm alone on an island, even though I'm surrounded by hundreds of people. Richard nodded slowly. I understand. More than you might think. After my first wife died, I felt that isolation keenly. The castle seemed empty, even though it was full of people. That's part of why I remarried, why I brought you here. But I realize now that I didn't think enough about what the transition would be like for you, how different this would be from what you knew. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered Bailey below. Tomorrow is Candlemas, the feast of the purification of the Virgin. Traditionally, it marks the midpoint of winter, the moment when we can begin to believe that spring will truly come. I want to hold a celebration in the Great Hall, something to lift everyone's spirits. A feast, music, perhaps some entertainment. Will you help me plan it? Eleanor felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Enthusiasm. Yes, she said. Yes, I would like that very much. The next day was a flurry of activity, as the entire household prepared for the evening's celebration. The great hall was decorated with holly and ivy, the last of the greenery that had been saved from Christmas. Extra wood was brought for the fire, and the cooks worked from dawn to prepare a feast worthy of the occasion. There would be roasted meats and fish, pies and tarts, spiced wine and ale, and a special cake baked with a bean hidden inside. Whoever found the bean in their portion would be crowned king or queen of the feast, allowed to command the entertainment for the evening. Eleanor worked alongside Beatrice and Alice and Lady Catherine, arranging the tables, setting out the best plates and cups, making sure everything was perfect. As she worked, she felt the lethargy of the past weeks lifting. Having a purpose, a goal, something to look forward to, it made all the difference. She saw the same lightness in the faces of the others, a new energy in their movements. The prospect of warmth and food and fellowship was like water to parched ground. As evening fell and the household gathered in the great hall, Eleanor stood beside Richard and surveyed the scene. The fire roared in the great hearth, its warmth reaching even to the far corners of the room. Candles blazed on every table, creating pools of golden light. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air, and already people were laughing, talking, the usual strict separations of rank relaxing slightly in the festive atmosphere. Richard raised his hand for silence, and the hall quieted. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying to every corner, "we gather tonight to celebrate Candlemas, to mark the turning of the year towards spring. We have survived the worst of winter, and though cold days still lie ahead, we can now believe that warmth will return. Tonight, we feast together, we warm ourselves together, and we remember that we are not alone in our struggles but part of a community that supports and sustains each other. Let the celebration begin." The cheer that went up shook the rafters, and then the feast began in earnest. Alina found herself caught up in the joy of it, moving from table to table, speaking with people she had never had reason to talk to before, learning names and stories. She met the blacksmith, a huge man named Jeffrey who told her about the special horseshoes he was making that would give better grip on ice. She spoke with the women who worked in the laundry, who described the difficulty of drying clothes in winter when everything had to be hung near the kitchen fires. She listened to the guards who manned the walls, who spoke of the beauty of the winter landscape seen from the towers, how the world looked pure and clean under its blanket of snow. And everywhere she went, people thanked her. For the blankets, for the furs, for the care she had shown to young Thomas, for 100 small kindnesses that she had barely been aware of giving. It humbled her and filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the blazing fire. The bean in the cake was found by a young servant boy named Robin, who was crowned king of the feast with a wreath of holly, and immediately commanded that everyone must share their most embarrassing moment. What followed was an hour of laughter as people told stories about themselves, from the cook who once served a pie with the spoon still in it to Lord Richard himself, who confessed that he had once fallen off his horse in front of his entire company of knights because he was distracted by a pretty milkmaid. Alina laughed until her sides ached, and when it was her turn, she told about the time she had tried to impress a visiting nobleman by showing off her archery skills, only to send the arrow flying so far off course that it ended up in the privy. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, someone brought out a lute, and there was music. Alina found herself dancing, something she hadn't done since her wedding, her hands clasped with Catherine's as they moved through the steps of a simple country dance. Other couples joined them, and soon half the hall was dancing while the other half clapped and sang along. The warmth of the fire and the movement and the press of so many bodies turned the hall almost hot, and people began shedding their outer layers, their faces flushed and happy. It was late when Alina finally retired to her chamber, Beatrice and Alice helping her undress and prepare for bed. She was exhausted but happy, filled with a contentment she hadn't felt since leaving her childhood home. "That was a wonderful evening, my lady," Beatrice said as she brushed out Alina's hair. "The household needed it. We all needed to remember that winter doesn't last forever, that there's joy to be found even in the cold." "It was perfect," Alina agreed. "I feel renewed, ready to face whatever February brings." Alice, who was laying out Alina's night clothes, suddenly said, "My lady, do you know the old saying about Candlemas weather?" "No, what is it?" "If Candlemas Day were fair and bright, winter would have another flight. But if Candlemas Day has clouds and rain, winter is gone and will not come again." Eleanor thought about the day's weather. It had been clear and bright, the sun shining on the snow with almost blinding intensity. According to the saying, that meant more winter to come. But somehow she found she didn't mind. She had furs to keep her warm, friends to keep her company, and a purpose that gave meaning to her days. Winter could stay as long as it needed. She would endure. But February had one more trial to bring, one that would test Eleanor's resilience in ways she could not have anticipated. It came 3 days after the Candlemas feast, in the form of a messenger who arrived at the castle gates on a half-frozen horse, bearing news from Eleanor's family home. Eleanor was in her solar with Catherine when Beatrice came to summon her, the maid's face grave with concern. "My lady, Lord Richard needs you in the great hall. There's a messenger and I think the news is not good." Eleanor's heart clenched with immediate fear. She rose quickly, Catherine at her side, and hurried to the hall where she found Richard speaking with a young man she recognized as one of her father's servants. The man's clothes were caked with frozen mud, his face haggard with exhaustion and cold. "Eleanor," Richard said when he saw her, and his use of her name rather than her title warned her that something was seriously wrong. "This man brings word from your father's estate. There has been an outbreak of fever in the region. Your sister Anne." "I'm sorry, Eleanor. She died 5 days ago." The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. Anne, her baby sister, just 16 years old, with her ready laugh and her terrible singing voice and her passion for her garden. Anne, who had begged to be allowed to come visit Eleanor at Shadow Beaumont in the spring, who had made Eleanor promise to teach her all about running a great household. Anne, who had life and warmth and so many years ahead of her, suddenly disappeared, extinguished like a candle flame, lost to fever and cold. She felt Catherine's hand on her elbow, steadying her, and Richard's voice from what seemed like a great distance. "Sit down, Eleanor. Let me get you some wine." But Eleanor shook her head, pulling herself together with effort. "My father, my mother, Margaret." "All well, my lady," the messenger said quickly. It was only Lady Anne who was sick. The fever came on suddenly, and despite the physician's best efforts, she was gone within 3 days. "Your lady mother wanted you to know immediately." "She said," he faltered. "She said that Anne spoke of you at the end, that she wanted to see you." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, hot against her cold cheeks. "I should have been there," she whispered. "I should have been with her." "You couldn't have known," Richard said gently. "No one could have predicted this." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She was thinking of Anne in her final hours, fevered and frightened, calling for a sister who was 6 days' journey away, who had left her to marry a stranger, who had been so focused on her own adjustment to her new life that she hadn't even written to her family in weeks. The guilt was crushing, a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She spent the next few days in a kind of numb fog, going through the motions of her daily routines but feeling disconnected from everything around her. She attended prayers in the chapel, but the words seemed meaningless. She supervised the household tasks, but took no joy in them. At night, she lay in her bed beneath mountains of furs and felt colder than she had ever felt in her life, a cold that came from inside and could not be warmed by any external fire. It was Alice who finally broke through her grief in an unexpected way. The girl came to her chamber one evening when Alina was sitting alone by the fire, staring into the flames and seeing nothing. "My lady," Alice said softly, "may I speak plainly?" Alina nodded, not really caring what Alice might say, but willing to let the girl talk if it gave her comfort. "When my mother died," Alice began, her voice steady despite the emotion in it, "I thought I would die too. The grief was so terrible, like a beast eating me from inside. I couldn't understand how the world could keep turning, how the sun could keep rising when she was gone. It seemed wrong, disrespectful to her memory, that life simply continued." She moved closer, kneeling beside Alina's chair. "But then I realized something. My mother would not have wanted me to stop living. She would have wanted me to take the love she gave me and use it to make my own life, to help others as she had helped me. By living well, by being kind, by making the world a little warmer for those around me, I honor her memory far more than I would by drowning in grief." Alina looked at Alice, really looked at her for the first time in days, and saw the wisdom in the young girl's eyes, a wisdom earned through her own suffering and loss. "Your sister loved you, my lady," Alice continued. "That much is clear from how you speak of her. Don't you think she would want you to keep being the person you've become here? The lady who cares about servants sleeping cold in tower rooms. The lady who nurses sick children through the night. The lady who brings warmth to a cold castle, not just through fires and furs, but through kindness and compassion." Alina felt something crack open inside her chest, and suddenly she was sobbing. Truly sobbing for the first time since hearing the news, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Alice held her, this slip of a girl who had known her own grief and survived it, and let her cry until the worst of the storm had passed. When Alina could finally speak again, she said, "Thank you, Alice. You're wise beyond your years." "No, my lady," Alice said, rising and returning to her duties. "I just know that the living must keep living, and that love doesn't end with death. Your sister is gone from this world, but the love between you remains. Let it warm you, even in this cold winter. Let it guide you in the work you do here." In the weeks that followed, Alina took Alice's words to heart. She threw herself into her duties with renewed purpose, seeing them now not as obligations, but as opportunities to honor Anne's memory. Every servant she helped, every small kindness she performed, every moment of warmth she brought to the cold stone castle, these were offerings laid on the altar of her grief, transformations of loss into love. She established a new tradition. Once a week, she would have a large pot of hot soup prepared in the kitchen, enriched with whatever meat and vegetables could be spared, and she would personally serve it to the servants who worked outdoors, the guards and the stable hands and the workers who maintained the castle's defenses. She would pour the steaming liquid into their bowls, look them in the eyes, call them by name, ask about their families, their concerns, their lives. It was unprecedented for a noble lady to do such work, and it scandalized Chamberlain Hugh and the older, more conservative members of the household. But Richard, to Eleanor's surprise and gratitude, defended her actions. "My wife honors God and the memory of her sister by caring for the least among us," he said firmly when Hugh dared to object. "If you find that troubling, Hugh, perhaps you should examine your own soul and ask why Christian charity offends you." Hugh said no more, but his resentment simmered, and Eleanor knew she would need to be careful. A chamberlain who felt his authority threatened could make life difficult in countless small ways. But she also knew she couldn't stop what she was doing. It was too important, not just to those she helped, but to her own sense of purpose and meaning. As February gave way to March, and the days gradually grew longer, Eleanor began to notice subtle changes in the castle's atmosphere. The cold was still intense. The stone walls still held their chill, but there was a different quality to the light, a promise in the air that winter's grip was loosening, slowly but surely. Icicles that had hung from the battlements for months began to drip at midday, forming small pools of water that froze again at night, but marked the beginning of the thaw. Birds that had been silent for weeks began tentative songs. The snow in the bailey, which had been pristine white, turned gray and slushy as it began to melt. And with the changing season came another change. Eleanor discovered she was with child. Beatrice was the first to suspect, nodding the morning sickness that sent Eleanor rushing to the chamber pot, the tenderness in her breasts, the unusual exhaustion that overtook her in the afternoons. The midwife was summoned, an ancient woman named Goodwife Marjorie, who had delivered half the bobbies in the region over the past 40 years. She examined Eleanor with gentle, experienced hands and confirmed what Beatrice had suspected. "You're about 6 weeks along, my lady," Goodwife Marjorie said with a satisfied nod. "If all goes well, you'll birth the baby in October, after the harvest is in but before the cold returns. A good time for a child to enter the world." Eleanor felt a strange mix of emotions at the news. Joy, certainly, at the thought of a child, her own baby to love and nurture. Fear, knowing the dangers of childbirth, the many women who died in the birthing bed or in the days after. Anxiety, wondering if she would be a good mother, if she could provide the love and guidance a child needed. And underneath it all, a renewed sense of grief for Anne, who would never have this experience, never hold her own child, never know this particular mixture of terror and anticipation. When she told Richard the news, his reaction surprised her. His stern face softened into something approaching wonder, and he took her hands in his with a gentleness she hadn't known he possessed. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you have given me hope for the future. After my first wife died, I thought I would never know joy again. But you've brought life to this castle, and now you're bringing new life into the world. I am grateful beyond words." It was the most tender thing he had ever said to her, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, a wall coming down, an intimacy beginning to form that went beyond the physical duties of marriage. Perhaps, she thought, they might actually become partners in truth, not just in name. The household rejoiced at the news of the coming heir. Even Hugh the chamberlain was unbent enough to offer his congratulations, though Elinor suspected his pleasure had more to do with securing the Beaumont line than any personal affection for her. But the servant's joy was genuine, and Elinor was touched by the small gifts that began appearing in her chamber. A tiny carved cradle from old Bernard the stableman, a set of soft wool baby blankets from the women who worked in the laundry, a beautifully embroidered christening gown from Lady Catherine. "You've made yourself beloved," Catherine told her as they sat together in the sun, both working on baby clothes. "Not just respected, but truly beloved. That's a rare gift for any noble lady, and you've earned it in just a few months." "I don't feel like I've done anything special," Elinor protested. "Just tried to be kind, to help where I could." "That's exactly what makes it special," Catherine said. "Kindness from someone who has power over you, who doesn't need to be kind, who could be cold and cruel and suffer no consequences. That kindness means everything. You've shown people that nobility can mean more than just high birth and expensive furs. It can mean a nobility of spirit, a generosity of heart." As March progressed and the castle slowly began to emerge from winter's grip, Elinor established yet another new tradition, this one aimed at the children of the household. She had noticed that there were perhaps a dozen children between the ages of 5 and 12 living in the castle, the sons and daughters of servants and soldiers, and that they spent their days largely unsupervised, running wild through the bailey, getting into mischief, receiving no education beyond what they learned from watching their parents work. She decided to gather these children together for an hour each day in a small room off the Great Hall, where she would teach them their letters and numbers, tell them stories, and help them learn the skills they would need for whatever life held for them. It was revolutionary. Peasant children were not typically educated, and many people, including Hugh, thought it was a waste of time and effort. But Elinor persisted, and within a week, she had a dozen eager students sitting on the floor of her makeshift schoolroom, their faces lit with curiosity as she showed them how to form letters with charcoal on slate tablets she had commandeered from the castle stores. Alice helped her patient with the younger children who struggled with the concepts, encouraging those who caught on quickly. One of her most dedicated students was a boy named William, son of a washerwoman, who showed a remarkable aptitude for learning. He soaked up everything Elinor taught him, constantly asking questions, making connections between different ideas. Elinor saw in him the kind of quick intelligence that, in a noble child, would have been carefully cultivated and could lead to positions of great influence. In a servant's son, it would likely be wasted, leaving him to a life of manual labor that would never fully engage his mind. The injustice of it bothered Elinor, but she didn't know what she could do beyond giving William what education she could and hoping that someday, somehow, he might find a way to use his gifts. She began setting aside extra time to work with him individually, teaching him Latin along with English, showing him how to do more complex mathematical calculations. Richard noticed her spending time with the boy and asked about it one evening. "William is exceptional," she explained. "It seems wrong to let such intelligence go to waste. I thought perhaps, if he shows continued promise, he might be trained as a clerk or a steward, someone who works with accounts and letters rather than his hands." Richard considered this. "It's unusual," he said slowly, "but not unheard of. The church sometimes takes in promising boys from common families and trains them as scribes or administrators. I could write to the abbey at Cluny, see if they would consider taking him as a student when he's a bit older. They're always in need of educated men." Eleanor felt a surge of joy at this unexpected support. "Would you truly do that?" "I would," Richard said. "You've shown me that there's value in lifting people up, in helping them reach their potential regardless of their birth. It goes against much of what I was taught, but I'm beginning to think that the old ways aren't always the best ways." It was a remarkable admission from a man as traditional as Richard, and it showed Eleanor just how much they were both changing, growing together into a partnership that was about more than just bloodlines and alliances. They were building something new, a household that balanced respect for tradition with openness to change, that maintained proper hierarchy while recognizing the common humanity that bound them all. As the last weeks of winter passed and April approached, bringing with it the first true warmth and the greening of the earth, Eleanor often found herself reflecting on the months since she had arrived at Chateau Beaumont. She thought of the girl she had been then, frightened and lonely, shivering in her cold chamber and wondering how she would survive. And she thought of the woman she was becoming, still cold sometimes, still learning but stronger, more purposeful, more connected to the life around her. The furs she wore, the mountains of pelts and blankets that had seemed like such a strange luxury when she first arrived, she now understood as symbols of more than just warmth. They represented the resources that separated life from death in the harsh medieval winter. Yes, but they also represented the choices people made about who deserved comfort and who didn't, who was worth keeping warm and who could be allowed to freeze. By redistributing those resources, by insisting that everyone in her household had at least basic protection from the cold, she had made a statement about the value of every human life, regardless of rank or status. And the cold itself, which she had initially experienced as nothing but suffering, she now saw as a teacher. It had taught her about the fragility of life, the importance of community, the ways that shared hardship could bring people together or drive them apart depending on how they chose to respond to it. It had shown her the difference between existing and truly living, between mere survival and creating meaning and purpose, even in difficult circumstances. As she sat in her chamber on a rare warm evening in early April, the fire burning low because for the first time in months it wasn't really needed, Eleanor placed her hand on her still flat belly and thought about the child growing there. What kind of world would she bring this baby into? Still a world of cold winters and stone castles, of strict hierarchies and limited choices, of dangers that ranged from fever to famine to war. But also, she hoped, a world where kindness mattered, where compassion could make a real difference, where one person's choices to care for others could ripple outward in ways both large and small. "My little one," she whispered to the baby who couldn't yet hear her, "you will be born into a world that can be cruel and cold. But I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to make sure you know warmth, not just the warmth of furs and fires, but the warmth of love and purpose and connection. And I will teach you that with privilege comes responsibility, that having much means owing much, that the furs we wear to keep ourselves warm should never blind us to those who have none." She thought of Anne then, as she did every day, and sent a silent prayer up for her sister's soul. Anne would never meet this child, never know the woman Eleanor was becoming, never see the changes that had been wrought in this cold stone castle. But in some way, Eleanor felt that Anne was part of it all, that her death had catalyzed Eleanor's transformation from a passive victim of circumstance into an active agent of change. The grief would never fully leave, she knew that now, but it could be transformed into something purposeful, something that honored Anne's memory by making the world a little better, a little warmer than it had been. The next morning brought news that would test Eleanor's newfound strength in unexpected ways. She was breaking her fast in the great hall with Richard when a commotion at the castle gates drew their attention. Moments later, a bedraggled group of travelers was ushered into their presence. A merchant named Robert, his wife Jean, and their 3 children, along with 2 servants. They were all half frozen, their clothes in tatters, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. "My lord, my lady," the merchant said, dropping to his knees, "I beg your mercy and hospitality. We've been traveling from Paris to Lyon, but we were set upon by bandits 3 days ago. They took our horses, our goods, everything of value. We've been walking since then, trying to reach civilization before we froze or starved. When we saw your castle, it seemed like the hand of God pointing us toward salvation." Eleanor looked at the children, 2 girls and a boy, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 10. They huddled against their mother, their lips blue with cold, their eyes huge in their thin faces. Without hesitation, she rose from her seat. "Beatrice," she called. "Alice, come quickly. We have guests who need immediate care. Hot food, warm clothing, beds prepared in the guest quarters. Hurry now." Richard looked at her with approval. "Well commanded, wife. Master Robert, you and your family are welcome to our hospitality for as long as you need it. We'll send men to search for the bandits, though I fear they're long gone by now. In the spring, we see more of such lawlessness as desperate men emerge from winter looking for easy prey." Over the following days, as the merchant's family recovered from their ordeal, Eleanor learned their story in greater detail. Robert had been a prosperous trader in fine cloth, making the journey from Paris to Lyon twice a year to deliver goods to wealthy clients. This trip, he had been carrying an especially valuable cargo of silk and velvet, worth enough to keep his family comfortable for several years. The bandits had taken everything, leaving them with only the clothes on their backs and their lives. "I should be grateful," Robert said to Alina one afternoon as they sat in the solar, where his family had been installed while they regained their strength. "We're alive, and that's more than many can say after such an encounter. But I don't know how I'll rebuild. Everything I had, everything I worked for over 15 years, it's gone. I'm ruined." Alina felt deep sympathy for the man's plight, but she also saw an opportunity. "Robert," she said carefully, "what if you didn't need to return to the road? What if there was work for you here at Chateau Beaumont?" He looked at her in surprise. "My lady, I'm grateful for your hospitality, but I'm a cloth merchant, not a farmer or a soldier. What use would I be in a castle?" "Actually, a great deal of use," Alina said, an idea forming even as she spoke. "I've been thinking about the household management, about all the goods we need to purchase from traveling merchants like yourself. Clothes, certainly, but also spices, candles, fine metalwork, anything that can't be produced on the estate. Currently, we wait for merchants to come to us, and we pay whatever prices they ask because we have no other choice. But what if we had someone who understood trade, who could travel to markets and fairs to purchase goods at better prices? Someone who knew quality from inferior work, who could negotiate favorable terms." Robert's expression shifted from despair to interest. "You're describing a household purveyor, someone who manages procurement for a great estate. It's a respected position, typically held by men of some education and experience in commerce." "Which describes you perfectly," Alina said. "I would need to discuss it with Lord Richard, of course, but I think he would see the wisdom in it. You would have a salary, accommodation for your family here in the castle, security and stability. And we would have someone we could trust to manage our purchasing, someone with expertise in exactly the areas where we need it most." She paused, then added, "Also, I've been thinking about establishing a small school here, something more formal than the lessons I currently give to the servants' children. Your daughters and son, they would benefit from education. Jean could help manage the household, perhaps working with the women in the sewing rooms. Your servants could be integrated into our staff. It would be a new beginning for all of you." Robert's eyes filled with tears. "My lady, such generosity, I don't know what to say. After losing everything, to be offered not just charity but a real position, a future. I'm overwhelmed." "Then say yes," Alina said with a smile. "Say yes, and let's discuss the details with Lord Richard tonight." Richard, as Alina had hoped, saw the practical benefits of the arrangement immediately. He had been dissatisfied with the household's purchasing practices for years, but had never thought of a solution. Robert's expertise would save the castle money in the long run and ensure better quality goods. It was a business decision as much as a charitable one, which made it easy for Richard to approve. Within a week, Robert and his family were settled into chambers near Alina's own quarters, and he had begun inventorying the castle's needs and planning his first purchasing trip for when the spring roads became fully passable. His wife Jean proved to be a skilled seamstress with a good eye for fashion, and Alina put her in charge of the household's textile work, overseeing the production of clothing and linens for both the family and the servants. The children joined Alina's informal school, bringing the number of students to 15. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Robert's older daughter, Marie, who was 9 years old and possessed of a precocious intelligence and a natural talent for organization. Alina noticed that the girl was constantly making lists, keeping track of things, organizing her younger siblings' games with a sophistication beyond her years. "Marie," Alina said to her one day, "how would you like to learn about household management? Not just the lessons I teach to all the children, but real training in how to run a great estate." The girl's face lit up with an excitement that reminded Alina painfully of Anne. "Oh yes, my lady. I love organizing things, keeping track of details. My father always said I should have been born a boy because I have a head for business." "Nonsense," Alina said firmly. "Women can manage estates just as well as men, sometimes better. I'm proof of that, and you will be too. Come with me now, and I'll show you how we keep the household accounts." Over the following weeks, Marie became Alina's shadow, learning every aspect of castle management. She watched as Alina reviewed the accounts with the chamberlain, noting every expenditure and income. She accompanied Alina on inspections of the storerooms, learning to assess the quality of stored grain and preserved meat, to estimate how much would be needed to see the household through to the next harvest. She sat in on Alina's meetings with the steward about planting schedules and crop rotation. She learned about managing servants, about the delicate balance between firmness and kindness, about how to command respect while still being approachable. Hugh the chamberlain was predictably outraged by this development. A 9-year-old girl, and a merchant's daughter at that, being trained in matters that were traditionally the province of noble-born men. It was unthinkable, improper, a violation of every standard of appropriate behavior. He confronted Alina about it one morning in her solar, his pinched face tight with disapproval. "My lady, I must protest this arrangement with the merchant's daughter. It is not fitting for a girl of such low birth to be involved in matters of estate management. What if she shares sensitive information with her father? What if she makes errors in the accounts? What if she proves to be more capable than you, Hugh?" Alina interrupted, her voice cold. "Is that what really concerns you? That this clever child might show up the inadequacies in your own management?" Hugh's face flushed red. "My lady, I have served this household faithfully for 20 years. I have never been accused of inadequacy." "Nor are you being accused now," Alina said, moderating her tone slightly. "But Hugh, the world is changing. We must change with it or be left behind. Marie has gifts that should be cultivated, and I intend to cultivate them. You may assist in her training if you wish, sharing your extensive experience and knowledge. Or you may continue to object and make yourself irrelevant to her education. The choice is yours." It was a skillful piece of manipulation, offering Hugh the chance to be part of Marie's training rather than simply opposing it. Eleanor saw the calculation in his eyes, the moment when he realized that he could either fight this battle and likely lose, or he could adapt and maintain at least some influence over the process. "Very well, my lady," he said stiffly. "I will assist in the girls' education, though I maintain my reservations about the appropriateness of this arrangement." "Your reservations are noted, Hugh. Now shall we review this month's expenditures? I believe Marie should sit in on this discussion. She needs to understand how we track spending and identify areas where we might economize." As April blossomed into May and the world transformed from brown and gray to a riot of green and color, Eleanor felt herself transforming as well. The morning sickness had passed, and she was now in what the midwife called the blooming time, when pregnant women often felt their best. Her belly was beginning to swell, though not yet prominently enough to require changes to her clothing. She felt energetic, purposeful, more alive than she had ever felt. The castle, too, was transformed by the coming of spring. Windows that had been shuttered against winter's cold were thrown open to let in fresh air and sunlight. Tapestries were taken down, shaken out, aired. The rushes on the floors were swept away and replaced with fresh ones mixed with sweet-smelling herbs, lavender and mint, rosemary and chamomile. People shed their heavy furs and thick wool layers, moving more freely in lighter clothing. Work that had been impossible during winter's grip now resumed. Repairs to the castle's walls and roofs, work in the fields, the endless cycle of planting and tending that would, God willing, provide food for the next winter. Eleanor organized a massive spring cleaning of the entire castle, something that hadn't been done properly in years. Every room was scrubbed, every corner swept, every piece of furniture polished. She had the furs and blankets that had kept them all alive through winter carefully cleaned and stored in chests with herbs to prevent moth damage. Looking at those carefully folded pelts, remembering the nights she had spent buried under them, shivering despite their warmth, she felt a profound gratitude for their existence and a renewed commitment to ensuring that next winter, everyone in the household would be adequately provided for. She also began planning ahead for the following winter in more systematic ways. Working with Marie, who proved to be extraordinarily talented at this kind of strategic thinking, Eleanor created detailed inventories of everything they had: food stores, fuel, clothing, bedding. Then she calculated what they would need to get through the next winter, assuming it would be as harsh as the one just passed. The gaps between what they had and what they needed became the basis for planning. How much more grain to grow or purchase? How many more animals to slaughter and preserve? How much more wood to cut and store? How many more blankets and furs to acquire? "You see, Marie," Eleanor explained as they worked on these calculations, "the key to surviving winter is preparation in summer and autumn. If you wait until the cold comes to realize you don't have enough fuel or food, it's too late. Everything must be anticipated, planned for, acquired while it's still possible to do so." Marie absorbed all of this with the intense focus of a natural student. It's like a battle strategy, she observed. My father once described a siege he witnessed, how the defenders only survived because they had stockpiled enough supplies before the siege began. Managing a household through winter is similar, isn't it? You're defending against the siege of cold and scarcity. That's exactly right, Alina said, impressed by the girl's insight. And like any good commander, you must think not just about your own needs, but about everyone under your command. A lord who keeps himself warm while his soldiers freeze will soon find he has no soldiers left to command. This principle guided Alina's planning for the next winter. She made sure that adequate bedding was allocated not just to the noble family and upper servants, but to everyone down to the lowest kitchen boy. She arranged for repairs to the servants' quarters, making sure that shutters fit properly, that chimneys drew well, that doors closed tightly against drafts. She worked with Robert to order good wool cloth that could be made into warm clothing for those who needed it. Some of this was simple pragmatism. Healthy, comfortable servants worked better than sick, miserable ones. But Alina knew it was more than that. She had come to genuinely care about the people in her household, to see them not as tools to be used, but as human beings deserving of dignity and basic comfort. Every time she saw Alice, thriving in her new position and no longer shivering in a cold tower room, she was reminded of what a difference small acts of kindness could make. As summer approached and Alina's pregnancy became more visible, she found herself growing closer to Richard as well. He began spending more evenings with her, not out of duty, but apparently because he wanted her company. They would sit together in the solar after supper, and he would tell her about his day, about problems with the harvest or disputes between tenants, and ask her advice. At first, Alina was hesitant to offer opinions, remembering how little he had seemed to value her input when she first arrived. But Richard now seemed genuinely interested in her perspective, and she gradually became more confident in sharing her thoughts. One warm June evening, as they sat together watching the sun set over the fields, Richard said something that surprised her. You know, Alina, when I married you, I thought I was doing my duty, providing an heir, fulfilling the obligations of my station. I didn't expect this, Alina prompted. Partnership, he said simply. A companionship. Someone who challenges me to be better than I was, to think beyond the narrow confines of how things have always been done. You've changed this household, Alina, and you've changed me. I'm grateful for it. Alina felt tears prick her eyes, hormones making her more emotional than usual. I've changed because of you too, Richard. Because you let me try new things. Because you supported me even when I'm sure you thought I was being foolish or inappropriate. Because you gave me the space to become who I needed to be. He reached over and took her hand, a gesture of affection that was still rare enough to feel significant. I hope our child inherits your compassion and your courage. Those are rarer qualities than noble blood. As the summer progressed, Alina's belly swelled with the growing child, and she had to adjust her activities accordingly. The midwife insisted that she rest more, avoid heavy labor, not tire herself out. Alina chafed at these restrictions, wanting to maintain her usual level of involvement in household affairs. But Beatrice and Alice conspired with the midwife to ensure she followed orders. "The household will not fall apart if you rest for an afternoon, my lady," Beatrice said firmly when Alina protested. "In fact, this is a good time for you to let others step up and take more responsibility. Young Marie is certainly ready for more duties, and I can manage the day-to-day operations perfectly well." Alina knew Beatrice was right, but it was hard to step back, to trust others with tasks she had taken such care to oversee herself. It was a lesson in delegation, in recognizing that good leadership wasn't about doing everything yourself, but about building capable teams and trusting them to do their work. Marie, in particular, rose to the challenge, taking on more and more responsibilities with a maturity far beyond her years. It was Marie who noticed the problem with the grain stores in late July, a discovery that potentially saved the household from disaster. She had been conducting one of her regular inventory checks when she noticed that several sacks of wheat in one of the storage buildings seemed lighter than they should be. Upon closer inspection, she found that rats had gotten into the stores and eaten significant quantities of grain, leaving droppings and damage throughout. She immediately reported this to Alina, who called for a complete inspection of all the storage buildings. The damage was extensive. Rats had infiltrated multiple storerooms, contaminating grain and flour that would have been essential for the winter ahead. Hugh the Chamberlain, whose responsibility it was to maintain the storage areas, had clearly been neglecting his duties. When confronted, he made excuses about how difficult it was to keep rats out, how it was an inevitable problem in any castle. Alina was furious. "Inevitable. Hugh, we depend on these stores to survive the winter. Every sack of grain lost to rats is food taken from someone's mouth. This is not an inevitable problem. It's a failure of proper management. The storage areas should have been kept sealed, traps set, cats placed to hunt any rodents. You've been lazy, Hugh, and it's cost us dearly." For the first time since Alina had arrived at Chateau Beaumont, she saw real fear in the Chamberlain's eyes. He realized, perhaps, that his position was no longer secure, that Alina would not tolerate incompetence simply because he had served the household for many years. "Marie," Alina continued, turning to the girl, "I want you to work with Bernard the stableman. He has several good barn cats that are excellent mousers. We're going to place cats in every storage building, and we're going to repair any holes or gaps where rats might enter. We'll need to move all the uncontaminated grain to secure areas and dispose of what's been ruined. Can you organize this?" Marie's face was serious as she nodded. "Yes, my lady. I'll see to it immediately." "Good. Hugh, you will assist Marie in this project. Consider it an opportunity to learn proper store management from someone who clearly has a better eye for detail than you do. The humiliation of being placed under the supervision of a 9-year-old girl was almost more than Hugh could bear, but he had no choice but to comply. Over the following weeks, working together despite Hugh's obvious resentment, Marie and the Chamberlain transformed the storage areas. Cats were installed and quickly proved their worth, catching rats by the dozen. Every gap and hole was sealed. New procedures were established for regular inspections. Marie created detailed inventory lists, noting exactly what was stored in each location, how much there was, and what condition it was in. Eleanor watched this process with satisfaction, knowing that she had made the right choice in training Marie despite all the objections. The girl had saved them from a potentially catastrophic shortage, and she had done it through careful attention to detail and a willingness to take responsibility seriously. These were qualities worth far more than noble birth. As August arrived, bringing with it the heat of high summer, Eleanor found herself increasingly uncomfortable. Her belly was now prominently swollen, making it difficult to move around easily. She spent more time resting in her solar, where Alice and Beatrice kept her company and helped her with light tasks like mending or sorting herbs. Lady Catherine visited daily, bringing her own young children to play quietly in Eleanor's presence. "I remember this stage," Catherine said one sweltering afternoon as they sat together, both women fanning themselves against the heat. "With Thomas, I felt like I was carrying a boulder. I couldn't get comfortable no matter how I positioned myself. But then he was born, and all the discomfort was forgotten in the joy of holding him." Eleanor tried to imagine that moment, tried to picture herself holding her own child, but it seemed distant, unreal. She felt trapped in her swollen body, counting the weeks until her due date in October, wondering how she would manage 2 more months of this discomfort. It was during one of these afternoon rest periods that Lady Catherine finally told Eleanor something she had been hinting at for weeks. They were alone in the solar, Alice having gone to fetch cool water, Beatrice busy elsewhere in the castle. "Eleanor," Catherine began hesitantly, "there's something I need to tell you, something about the winter you just survived and about Lady Marguerite, Richard's first wife." Eleanor set down her mending, sensing that this was important. "Go on." "Lady Marguerite died in childbirth," Catherine said, "but not in the way you might think. The birth itself went well enough. She delivered a healthy son. But it was February in the depths of winter, and she developed a fever afterward. The midwife said it was childbed fever, which many women claim, but I always thought. I wondered if the cold played a part. Her chamber was freezing, Eleanor. She insisted that the fires be kept low to save wood, that she needed to set an example of frugality for the household. She was so concerned with doing her duty, with being the proper lady of the castle, that she wouldn't take care of herself. And 3 days after the birth, she was dead. The baby followed her within a week. They said he couldn't thrive without his mother. Eleanor felt ice run through her veins, despite the summer heat. "Richard never told me this." "He doesn't speak of it," Catherine said. "The grief nearly destroyed him. For months, He was like a man walking in his sleep, going through the motions of living but feeling nothing. That's part of why he seemed so cold to you when you first arrived. He was afraid, I think, afraid to let himself care for you because he couldn't bear to lose another wife. And the baby, Alina whispered. He lost a son. And now I'm carrying another child, due in winter. He must be terrified. He is, Catherine confirmed, though he'd never admit it. That's why I'm telling you this, Alina. When your time comes, you must not be like Lady Marguerite. You must not put duty or propriety ahead of your health and your child's health. Keep your chamber warm, no matter what anyone says about wasting fuel. Rest as much as you need. Let others serve you. Your life and your child's life are more valuable than any store of firewood. Alina took Catherine's hand, gripping it tightly. Thank you for telling me. I understand so much more now. Richard's support for my changes to the household management, his approval when I redistributed the furs and blankets, his willingness to heat the castle more generously than his first wife did. He learned from that tragedy. He doesn't want to repeat it. No, Catherine agreed. He doesn't. And neither did I. I couldn't save Lady Marguerite. I didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. But I can help protect you. We all can. The entire household is invested in your safety and your child's safety. You've earned that loyalty through your kindness and your care for others. Now you must let us return that care. The conversation stayed with Alina through the remaining weeks of summer. She thought often about Lady Marguerite, a woman she had never met but whose legacy was everywhere in the castle. Marguerite had been the proper, traditional lady who maintained strict hierarchies and careful frugality. Alina was something different, something newer, and she carried the weight of proving that her approach could work, that compassion and generosity could coexist with effective household management. As September arrived and the harvest began in earnest, Alina felt the baby moving constantly in her womb, strong kicks and rolls that goodwife Marjorie assured her were signs of a healthy, vigorous child. A boy, I'd wager, the midwife said when she came for one of her regular examinations. Boys are typically more active in the womb, though there's no guaranteeing these things. Either way, the babe is strong and well-positioned. Barring complications, you should have an easy birth. Alina hoped the midwife was right, but she also knew that childbirth was never guaranteed to be easy or safe. Women died in childbirth all the time, even noblewomen with access to the best care available. She had seen her own mother through several pregnancies, including one stillbirth that had nearly killed her. Alina tried not to dwell on these fears, but they were there, lurking at the edges of her mind. To distract herself, she threw herself into final preparations for winter, working with Marie to ensure that everything was ready. The harvest was good this year, thank God, and the storage buildings were filled with grain and vegetables. Animals were being slaughtered and their meat preserved by salting, smoking, and drying. Firewood was being cut and stacked in massive piles. Eleanor had arranged for additional furs and blankets to be purchased from Robert's trading contacts, ensuring that no one would suffer as they had the previous winter. She also instituted a new policy. Every member of the household, from the highest to the lowest, would have their sleeping arrangements inspected before winter set in. Any chamber that was too drafty, any bedding that was inadequate, any fire that didn't draw properly, these things would be addressed before the cold came. It was an ambitious undertaking, requiring careful organization and significant resources, but Eleanor was determined that no child would spend a winter crying from cold as Alice had done, that no servant would shiver through the night under a single thin blanket. Hugh objected, of course, to the expense and the disruption, but his authority had been so diminished by the grain storage fiasco that his objections carried little weight. Richard approved Eleanor's plans without hesitation, and the work proceeded through September and into October. Eleanor's due date came and went without the baby arriving. Goodwife Marjorie was unconcerned. "First bobbies are often late," she said cheerfully. "The babe will come when it's ready. Just rest and wait." But Eleanor was finding it increasingly difficult to rest. She was enormous now, her belly so swollen that she couldn't see her own feet. Everything ached, her back, her hips, her legs. She couldn't sleep comfortably, no matter how many pillows Alice arranged around her. She was tired of being pregnant, tired of waiting, tired of the anxiety that increased with each passing day. On a cold, gray morning in late October, just as the first serious frost of autumn painted the castle walls white and Eleanor was beginning to think she might be pregnant forever, the pains finally began. They started as a low, dull ache in her back, easy to dismiss at first. But by midday, the ache had transformed into unmistakable contractions that took her breath away. Beatrice immediately sent for Goodwife Marjorie and Lady Catherine, and within an hour, Eleanor's chamber had been transformed into a birthing room. The fire was built up high, making the room almost stifling despite the cold day outside. Clean linens were laid out, hot water prepared, herbs set to steeping for pain relief and to prevent infection. Catherine held Eleanor's hand, while Beatrice wiped her forehead with cool clothes. Alice hovered at the edges, ready to run errands or fetch anything that might be needed. And Goodwife Marjorie moved between them all with the calm confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. "Breathe through the pains, my lady," the midwife instructed. "Don't fight them. Your body knows what to do. Just let it work." Eleanor tried to follow the instructions, but as the hours passed and the contractions grew stronger, she found it increasingly difficult to remain calm. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced, coming in waves that built and crested and crashed, leaving her gasping and exhausted in the brief respites between. She thought of all the women who had done this before her, all the mothers throughout history who had endured this agony to bring life into the world. She thought of Lady Marguerite, who had survived this ordeal only to die days later from fever and cold. "I'm frightened," she whispered to Catherine during one of the lulls between contractions. "I know," Catherine said, squeezing her hand. But you're strong, Eleanor. Stronger than Marguerite ever was. You've survived your first winter here. You've transformed this household. You've made yourself beloved by everyone in the castle. You can do this too. The labor lasted through the afternoon and into the evening. Outside Eleanor's windows, she could hear the castle settling in for the night, the changing of the guard, the sounds of the evening meal being served in the great hall, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing even as she struggled to bring new life into the world. At some point, she heard Richard's voice in the corridor, asking about her progress, but men were not allowed in the birthing chamber. Catherine went out to speak with him, returning a few minutes later to report that he was praying in the chapel. As darkness fell and the contractions reached their peak, Eleanor thought she could not bear another moment of this. She was exhausted beyond measure, wrung out with pain and effort. But good wife Marjorie was urging her to push, telling her the baby was almost here, just a little more, just a bit longer. And then, with one final tremendous effort that seemed to require every ounce of strength Eleanor possessed, the baby slid free into good wife Marjorie's waiting hands. For a moment, there was silence in the room, and Eleanor's heart clenched with terror. But then the baby let out a lusty wail, and the midwife was laughing. A girl, my lady. A beautiful, healthy girl with a fine set of lungs. Eleanor fell back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face, as good wife Marjorie cleaned the baby and wrapped her in soft wool blankets. Then the midwife placed the infant in Eleanor's arms, and Eleanor looked down at her daughter for the first time. She was perfect, tiny and red-faced and squalling, but perfect. Eleanor counted her fingers and toes, marveled at the delicate shell of her ears, the downy dark hair on her head, the way her little mouth opened and closed like a baby bird's. Love crashed over Eleanor like a physical force, so intense it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Catherine was crying too, and even Beatrice's eyes were suspiciously bright. Alice stood in the corner, her hands clasped to her chest, her face radiant with joy. Good wife Marjorie bustled about, completing the necessary tasks after birth, but she kept glancing at Eleanor and the baby with a satisfied smile. "You did well, my lady," the midwife said. "Very well indeed. The babe is healthy and strong, and you came through it better than most. Now you must rest and recover your strength." Someone went to tell Richard, and moments later he was at the door, propriety forgotten in his eagerness to see his child. When Eleanor looked up and saw his face, she saw tears in his eyes too. "A daughter," she said softly. "I hope you're not disappointed." Disappointed. He crossed to the bed and looked down at the baby with wonder. "She's beautiful. She's perfect. Eleanor, you've given me more than I ever dared hope for." He reached out tentatively, and Eleanor placed the baby in his arms. Richard held his daughter with surprising gentleness for such a stern man, and Eleanor saw his face transform with the same overwhelming love she felt. "What shall we name her?" he asked. Eleanor had been thinking about this for months. "And," she said, "after my sister, if that pleases you." "It pleases me very much," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. "Anne de Beaumont. Welcome, little Anne. Welcome to your home." Over the following days, as Elena recovered from the birth and learned to nurse her daughter, the entire castle celebrated. Even those who had been skeptical of Eleanor's reforms, even Hugh the Chamberlain, seemed genuinely happy about the new arrival. Gifts poured in from everyone: tiny embroidered caps and gowns, carved wooden toys, soft blankets and shawls. Old Bernard presented a perfect miniature cradle, small enough for a doll but made with the same careful craftsmanship he used on full-sized furniture. The kitchen staff prepared special foods to help Elena regain her strength. The castle's women took turns visiting, offering advice and congratulations and their own birthing stories. But the gift that touched Elena most came from Alice. The girl presented her with a small, beautifully sewn blanket made from scraps of ermine fur, remnants from the robe Elena had given her that first winter night. "I've been working on it for months," Alice said shyly. "I wanted the baby to have something special, something made with love. And I wanted you to know that I'll never forget what you did for me, my lady. You saved me in more ways than you know. I hope I can help care for little Anne, help her grow up knowing the same kindness you showed me." Elena embraced Alice, this girl who had become so much more than a servant, who had become a friend and a symbol of what Elena hoped her daughter's world might be. True to Catherine's warning, Elena was meticulous about her recovery. She kept her chamber warm, almost too warm by the standards of the previous winter. She rested when she was tired, ate well, and allowed others to serve her. And when her milk came in and little Anne nursed hungrily, Elena felt a fierce determination to live, to be strong, to be there for her daughter in all the ways that mattered. November arrived, bringing with it the cold that Elena now knew so well. But this year, wrapped in her furs with her daughter sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside her bed, the cold seemed less threatening. The castle was prepared as it had never been before. Everyone had adequate bedding, sufficient fuel. The storage rooms were full of food. The walls had been repaired, the shutters fitted properly, the fires laid in every hearth where they were needed. On one of those early November evenings, Elena sat in her chamber with Richard, watching little Anne sleep. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first real snowfall of the winter. Elena thought about the girl she had been a year ago, arriving at this castle for the first time, terrified and lonely and so cold she thought she might never be warm again. "I was thinking," she said to Richard, "about why queens wore fur in bed, about why such mountains of pelts were necessary." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Richard asked, his arm around her shoulders. "That it wasn't really about the furs," Elena said slowly. "Or rather, the furs were essential, yes, but they were only part of it. What really kept us alive through that winter, what really protected us from the cold, was caring for each other. The furs kept our bodies warm, but it was kindness and community and purpose that kept our souls warm." Lady Marguerite had all the furs in the world, but she was cold in the ways that mattered most. She died not just from fever, but from isolation, from a philosophy that kept people separate and alone. She looked down at sleeping Anne, at her perfect little face peaceful in the firelight. I want our daughter to grow up understanding that with privilege comes responsibility, that the warmth we enjoy should be shared, not hoarded, that the measure of nobility isn't in blood or birth or the quality of one's furs, but in how we treat those who depend on us, how we care for those who have less, how we create warmth in a cold world. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She'll learn that from you. You've already begun teaching it to everyone in this castle. Alice Marie, young William, even crusty old Hugh, though he'd never admit it. You've shown us all a better way." Elinor thought of the year behind her and the years ahead. There would be more winters, more cold nights, more challenges and losses and griefs. Anne would grow up in a world that was still harsh, still unjust in many ways. But she would also grow up in a household where kindness mattered, where people looked out for each other, where even the humblest servant knew they had value and dignity. As Elinor sat there in her warm chamber, surrounded by furs that represented both survival and status, holding the hand of the husband who had become her true partner, listening to the soft breathing of the daughter who represented hope and future, she felt something she had not felt since leaving her childhood home. She felt at peace. The snow fell heavier outside, beginning to accumulate on the windowsill, but inside, the fire burned bright. Little Anne stirred in her sleep and made a small sound, and Elinor reached down to adjust her blanket, tucking the soft wool more securely around her tiny body. This child would never know the kind of cold that Alice had endured in that tower room. She would grow up warm and loved and secure, not because of her noble birth, but because she was born into a household that had learned the true meaning of warmth. And perhaps, Elinor thought, that was the real answer to why queens wore fur in bed. Not just to survive the physical cold of medieval winters, but to remind themselves that they were human, vulnerable to the same forces that threatened everyone. The furs were a barrier against death, yes, but they were also a reminder of mortality, of the thin line between comfort and suffering, between life and death. They were a call to gratitude for the resources that kept one alive, and a responsibility to ensure that others had access to those same resources. Elinor closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of her castle settling in for the night. The crackle of fires in hearths throughout the building, the murmur of voices from the hall below, the footsteps of guards making their rounds. These were the sounds of a community surviving together, supporting each other through another winter. This was what she had built in her year at Chateau Beaumont. This was her legacy, more valuable than any noble title or expensive fur. When spring came again, as it always did, the castle would emerge from winter having lost no one to cold or hunger. The servants would tell stories about the lady who changed everything, who showed them that nobility could mean something more than privilege. Young children like Marie and William would grow into their potential, shaped by the opportunities Elinor had given them. and little Anne would take her first steps in a world slightly warmer, slightly kinder than the one Eleanor had entered. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white silence. But inside the castle walls, wrapped in furs and warmed by fires and surrounded by love, Eleanor de Beaumont smiled and held her daughter close, knowing that she had found her place, her purpose, her home. The cold would come and go with the seasons, but the warmth she had created here, the warmth of human connection and compassion and care, would endure. That would last. That was what would truly keep them all alive through whatever winters lay ahead. And in the morning, when Anne woke hungry and crying, when the servants began their daily routines, when life continued its eternal cycle, Eleanor would be there, ready to face it all. Not as the frightened girl who had arrived here one gray November day, but as a woman who had learned that the greatest power she possessed was not the authority of her title or the wealth of her furs, but the simple, profound ability to care for others and to build a community rooted in kindness and mutual support. The fire burned low in the hearth, and Beatrice rose to build it up again before retiring to her own warm bed in chambers that Eleanor had made comfortable. Alice had long since gone to her room, no longer cold and crying, but safe and valued and loved. Throughout the castle, people slept in warmth that had been carefully prepared and generously distributed. And in her chamber at the heart of it all, Eleanor de Beaumont held her daughter and watched the snow fall, content at last, at peace with the life she had built from cold stone and warm hearts. This was why queens wore fur in bed. Not just to survive, but to remember that survival was a gift to be shared, a responsibility to be honored, a blessing to be extended to all who sheltered beneath their care. And as Eleanor finally drifted off to sleep, her daughter warm against her heart, she knew that she had learned this lesson well, and that she would spend the rest of her life teaching it to others, one act of kindness at a time, through all the winters yet to come.